Some promises survive longer than love, longer than poverty, even longer than memory itself. Naomi Carter kept her eyes lowered as she moved between crystal glasses and silver trays beneath the glow of the Moretti mansion's chandeliers, her black uniform pressed perfectly, her footsteps silent against the polished marble floors worth more than every apartment she had ever lived in combined. Around her, New York's elite laughed beneath golden light, the sound smooth and careless like people who had never once worried about rent notices or empty refrigerators. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed investments over aged whiskey, while women wrapped in diamonds compared vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons. Naomi existed among them the way shadows existed beneath candlelight, present but unnoticed. That was how Adrian Moretti preferred his staff. Invisible, efficient, replaceable. At the far end of the ballroom, Adrian stood near the fireplace in a charcoal suit tailored so sharply it made every other man in the room look unfinished. At 36, he carried power the way storms carried thunder, naturally, effortlessly, dangerously. People lowered their voices when he looked in their direction. Investors smiled too quickly around him. Even politicians laughed harder at his jokes. The city called him untouchable. Naomi only knew him as the man whose penthouse staff received instructions in whispers, and whose security detail never blinked. She approached table 12 with a silver tray balanced carefully in one hand, the thin chain around her neck hidden beneath the collar of her dress the way it always was. Champagne, one of the guests snapped without even looking at her face. Naomi nodded softly and reached forward to refill the crystal flute. That was when it happened. The chain slipped loose from beneath her collar. A small silver ring slid free and fell gently against the fabric of her uniform. Across the ballroom, Adrian Moretti froze. The whiskey glass stopped halfway to his lips. For one impossible second, the noise around him disappeared. No laughter, no music, no voices. Just the sight of that ring resting against the chest of a maid no one else in the room would remember tomorrow. The air seemed to tighten around him. Naomi noticed the chain had slipped and quickly tucked the ring back beneath her collar, embarrassed. "Sorry," she murmured automatically. One of the women seated at the table smirked as she glanced at Naomi's necklace. "Cute little ring for a housemaid," she said, her voice dripping with polished cruelty. "Is that supposed to be real silver?" Quiet laughter spread around the table. Naomi forced a polite smile, though her fingers instinctively touched the hidden ring beneath her uniform. "It belonged to someone important," she answered softly. Adrian set his glass down so carefully it barely made a sound. But Luca, the head of his security team, noticed immediately. In 12 years beside Adrian Moretti, he had seen the man negotiate million-dollar deals without changing expression, attend funerals without tears, and stare down rivals with absolute calm. He had never seen him look shaken. Adrian's eyes remained locked on Naomi as memories clawed their way out from places he had buried decades ago. Snow falling through broken windows. A shelter in Brooklyn that smelled like bleach and cold soup. A little girl with dark skin and tired eyes splitting a stale sandwich in half because she noticed another orphan boy pretending he wasn't hungry. And a cheap silver ring from a broken vending machine pressed into her tiny hand beneath flickering hallway lights. "When I become somebody," 12-year-old Adrian had whispered back then, trying to sound brave while wearing shoes with holes in the soles, "I'll come back and marry you." The room blurred slightly around him now, because the tiny scratch shaped like a star on the edge of that ring was impossible to mistake. Adrian Moretti had carved it there himself with a rusted nail 24 years ago. Adrian Moretti did not remember most faces from the orphanage anymore. Time had erased them the way rain erased chalk from sidewalks. But he remembered hunger. He remembered winter nights in Brooklyn when the radiators stopped working and every child slept in coats beneath thin blankets that smelled faintly of bleach. He remembered learning early that nobody came back for boys like him. Nobody adopted the angry ones. Nobody chose the children who looked at the world like they were already disappointed by it. Except one little girl with tired brown eyes and crooked braids who always sat beside him during dinner even when the older boys mocked her for it. Naomi had arrived at St. Catherine's Home for Children during the coldest January the city had seen in years. She was 8 years old and barely spoke for the first month. The nuns said she had lost her mother to illness and had no other family willing to take her in. Adrian remembered watching her from across the cafeteria the first day she sat alone clutching a tray with powdered mashed potatoes and canned green beans. She looked small enough to disappear into the oversized gray sweater hanging from her shoulders. Most children in the orphanage learned quickly to protect what little they had. Food disappeared fast. Shoes got stolen. Kindness rarely survived longer than a week. But Naomi had quietly slid half her cornbread onto Adrian's tray after noticing he had skipped lunch earlier that day. "You look hungry," she whispered without meeting his eyes. Adrian had stared at her like she was crazy. Nobody shared food there. Nobody gave something away unless they expected something back. But Naomi never asked for anything. Night after night, they sat together near the cracked windows while snow piled against the brick walls outside. Adrian would tell her stories he invented about the lives they would have one day. Huge apartments overlooking Manhattan. Fancy cars with heated leather seats. Steak dinners instead of powdered soup. Naomi always listened like she believed every word. "You really think people like us can become rich?" she once asked while wrapping her tiny hands around a paper cup of hot chocolate during Christmas week. Adrian had shrugged with more confidence than any 12-year-old orphan should have possessed. "I am going to become somebody," he said firmly. "Nobody is ever going to ignore me again." Naomi smiled then, small but real, and the sight of it stayed in Adrian's memory long after entire years disappeared. A few days later, he found an old vending machine near the subway station outside the orphanage that had been jammed open. Among the cheap plastic toys inside sat a tiny silver-colored ring meant for children. It looked worthless, scratched, and dull beneath the flickering station lights. But to Adrian, it looked like the kind of thing important people gave each other in movies. He spent nearly 20 minutes scratching a tiny star into the inside of the band using a rusted nail he found near the alley behind the shelter. That night, while the other children slept, Adrian sat beside Naomi on the hallway floor beneath the dim emergency light and placed the ring carefully into her hand. "What is this?" Naomi whispered, staring at it like it was real jewelry. Adrian looked away, embarrassed by how serious his own voice sounded. "A promise," he muttered. "When I get rich someday, I am coming back for you." Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "And then what?" Adrian swallowed hard before answering the question that somehow felt bigger than both of them. "Then I am going to marry you." Naomi laughed softly at first, but when she realized he meant it, her expression changed completely. She slipped the cheap little ring onto a chain around her neck because it was too small for her finger. "Okay," she whispered. "Then I will wait." 24 years later, the promise felt impossible beneath the weight of chandeliers, designer gowns, and polished marble that reflected every movement inside the Moretti mansion like a mirror. Naomi Carter kept her hands steady as she carried another silver tray through the ballroom, though her heart had not fully calmed since noticing Adrian Moretti staring at her earlier. Men like him did not notice women like her. That was one of the first lessons she had learned after beginning work at the estate 11 months ago. The wealthy looked through service workers the same way they looked through glass windows, acknowledging only the comfort provided, never the person behind it. Naomi preferred it that way. Invisible people survived longer. Across the ballroom, a jazz trio played softly near the grand staircase while servers moved carefully between guests dressed in silk and cashmere. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the midnight sky like scattered gold. Naomi had spent most of her life cleaning buildings she could never afford to enter through the front door. Now she worked inside one of the most powerful homes in the city, yet somehow still felt farther away from that world than ever. "Table 6 needs fresh drinks," another maid whispered while passing beside her. Naomi nodded immediately. "I have it." She moved toward the lounge area where Adrian's fiancée, Vanessa Sinclair, sat surrounded by socialites whose laughter sounded sharp enough to cut glass. Vanessa belonged perfectly in rooms like this. Blonde, elegant, born into old money and photographed often enough that Naomi recognized her from magazine covers before ever meeting her in person. Everything about her appeared polished, right down to the diamond bracelet sparkling around her wrist beneath candlelight. Naomi lowered her gaze respectfully while replacing empty glasses. "Thank you," one of the women said absently before pausing as Naomi leaned forward. The silver chain slipped slightly against her collar again. Vanessa's eyes narrowed immediately. "Well," she said with a small amused smile, "that is unexpected." Naomi instinctively touched the hidden ring beneath her dress. Excuse me, ma'am? Vanessa tilted her head toward the necklace. The ring. It looks sentimental. Another woman laughed softly. Or very inexpensive. The group chuckled politely. Naomi forced herself to remain calm. It was a gift, she answered quietly. Vanessa extended her champagne flute toward Naomi without breaking eye contact. From a boyfriend? Naomi hesitated only a second too long. Someone from a long time ago. How sweet, Vanessa replied, though there was no warmth in her voice. I always find it fascinating when people hold on to childish things for decades. Especially staff. More laughter followed, smoother this time, more confident. Naomi kept her expression neutral the way years of survival had taught her to do. Smile politely. Finish the task. Walk away before humiliation settles too deeply into your chest. I should return to work, she murmured. Of course, Vanessa said dismissively before taking a sip of champagne. And Naomi? Naomi paused. Yes, ma'am. Vanessa's smile sharpened slightly. You should really keep expensive guests from seeing personal jewelry while serving. Some people might misunderstand and think you are trying to appear above your position. Naomi nodded once and quietly stepped away, though her fingers tightened around the tray hard enough to make the silver tremble. Near the fireplace, Adrian watched the entire exchange unfold without saying a word. But Luca noticed the dangerous stillness settling over him again. Adrian's gaze followed Naomi as she disappeared into the crowd, one hand briefly touching the ring hidden beneath her uniform, like someone protecting the last surviving piece of a former life. The strange thing was not the ring anymore. It was her. The softness in her voice. The careful way she endured humiliation without bitterness. The habit of making herself smaller so other people could feel larger. Adrian remembered all of it. Because the little girl from St. Catherine's used to do the exact same thing. The party ended shortly after midnight, but Adrian Moretti remained standing alone beside the darkened fireplace long after the last guest disappeared into black luxury cars waiting outside the mansion gates. Manhattan shimmered beyond the tall windows beneath cold spring rain, the city lights blurred by water sliding slowly down the glass. Luca approached carefully, already sensing his boss was somewhere far away from the ballroom around him. Should I have the staff begin cleanup downstairs? Luca asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty staircase where Naomi had disappeared nearly 20 minutes earlier, carrying a tray of untouched champagne glasses. The maid, Adrian finally said, his voice low and distant. Naomi Carter. Luca frowned slightly. What about her? Adrian turned slowly, and something in his expression made even Luca straighten unconsciously. How long has she worked here? 11 months. Family. Luca blinked once. I would have to check her file. Adrian slipped one hand into his pocket, though his fingers remained tense beneath the fabric of his tailored slacks. Check it. Luca studied him carefully. In all the years he had worked for Adrian, the man had never once shown personal interest in household staff. Employees came and went constantly through the Moretti estate. Adrian barely remembered their names. But tonight was different. Luca had seen at the moment that silver ring slipped free beneath the chandelier light. You think she is someone you knew? Luca asked carefully. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. I do not know what I think. Upstairs, Naomi sat quietly in the staff laundry room folding tablecloths beneath fluorescent lighting that buzzed softly overhead. The glamour of the ballroom already felt like another universe entirely. Here, there were no crystal chandeliers or polished laughter. Just detergent, steam, and exhaustion settling into her shoulders after 14 straight hours on her feet. She rubbed her thumb gently across the hidden ring beneath her collar before continuing her work. You okay? Another maid named Rosa asked while sorting towels nearby. Naomi smiled faintly. Just tired. Rosa hesitated. Vanessa was cruel tonight. Naomi lowered her eyes again. It is fine. No, Rosa said softly. It was not. Naomi folded another linen napkin with careful precision. People like her do not understand what it means to keep something because it is all you have left. Rosa glanced toward the necklace chain visible near Naomi's collar. The ring. Naomi nodded faintly. Someone gave it to me when I was little. A boyfriend. Rosa teased gently. Naomi surprised herself by smiling for real this time, though sadness lingered beneath it. Not exactly. She remembered a freezing hallway. A skinny orphan boy trying to sound brave while promising impossible things with holes in his shoes and scraped knuckles. Most childhood memories faded over time, but Adrian had never faded completely. Not because she truly believed he would come back one day, but because he had been the first person who ever made her feel chosen. Upstairs in his private study, Adrian sat alone behind a massive walnut desk while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking Central Park. A crystal tumbler of whiskey rested untouched near his hand. On the desk before him sat an old photograph someone had recovered years ago from St. Catherine's Records after the building shut down. The image showed nearly 30 children standing outside the orphanage during winter. Adrian had looked at that picture dozens of times over the years without finding what he searched for. Tonight his eyes locked onto one small figure near the back row. A little black girl wearing an oversized sweater and crooked braids. Naomi. The same cautious eyes. The same quiet posture. Adrian leaned back slowly, stunned by the realization settling heavier with every passing second. He had spent 24 years believing he lost her forever. Meanwhile, she had been walking silently through his home carrying trays of champagne while everyone else looked past her. Adrian Moretti did not sleep that night. By 3 in the morning, the lights inside his private study still burned against the dark Manhattan skyline, while rain continued sliding down the windows in silver streaks. Files lay scattered across the massive walnut desk beside untouched whiskey and old photographs from St. Catherine's Home for Children. Lucas stood near the doorway holding a thin black folder he had personally retrieved from the estate employment archives less than an hour earlier. Naomi Carter, Lucas said quietly. 28 years old. Born in Brooklyn. No criminal record. Worked 2 jobs before coming here. One at a diner in Queens, another cleaning office buildings downtown. Adrian remained silent, staring at the photograph of the orphanage children again. Family, he asked without looking up. Mother passed away when she was 8. No confirmed father listed on records. She spent 6 years at St. Catherine's before entering foster care. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes. What happened after foster care? Luca hesitated slightly before continuing. 3 different homes by age 17. Worked through community college, but never finished because of financial issues. According to tax records, she spent most of her 20s supporting an elderly foster mother with medical bills. The room fell quiet except for distant thunder outside. Adrian leaned back slowly in his leather chair, his expression unreadable, but inside him something old and buried had begun cracking open in ways he did not know how to control. While he built an empire powerful enough to make politicians answer his calls, Naomi had spent her life surviving paycheck to paycheck. While he learned how to command rooms filled with billionaires, she learned how to disappear inside them. There is more, Luca added carefully. Adrian gave a slight nod. She never removed the necklace. Adrian's eyes sharpened immediately. What? One of the housekeepers mentioned it during orientation months ago. Apparently Naomi always wears it, even during overnight shifts. She almost panicked once when she thought she lost it. Adrian lowered his gaze toward the photograph again. He remembered that ring costing less than a subway ride. A worthless little trinket from a broken vending machine. Yet somehow she had carried it across 24 years of poverty, foster homes, and disappointment, while he had nearly convinced himself their childhood promise was only something desperate children said to survive cold nights. Across the estate, Naomi quietly prepared breakfast trays in the downstairs kitchen as sunrise began painting pale gray light across the windows. The mansion looked different in the mornings. Less glamorous. Less intimidating. Without the music and designer gowns, it was only another enormous building full of silence. Naomi tied her apron carefully while coffee brewed nearby, and cooks prepared pastries for the household staff. "You are here early," Mrs. Delgado, the head housekeeper, observed while reviewing inventory lists. Naomi smiled faintly. Could not sleep much. Mrs. Delgado glanced at her knowingly. Ignore last night. Rich people become cruel when they are bored. Naomi lowered her eyes. I am used to it. The older woman studied her for a moment before speaking softly. That is not something to be proud of. Naomi did not answer. A few minutes later, she lifted a tray carrying black coffee, fresh fruit, and toast prepared for Adrian's study upstairs. Usually another employee handled private deliveries to the boss himself, but half the morning staff had called out after the late event. Naomi moved quietly through the hallways, unaware that Adrian had spent the entire night reading every available detail about her life. She paused outside the study door and knocked gently. "Come in," Adrian's voice answered immediately. Naomi stepped inside carefully, keeping her eyes lowered as always. Morning light spilled across the room, illuminating papers scattered over the desk beside old photographs she could not clearly see from where she stood. "Your breakfast, sir," she said softly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. Not at the tray, not at the coffee, at her. At the woman who once shared cornbread with a hungry orphan boy before either of them understood how cruel the world could become. "Naomi," he said quietly, testing the sound of her name again after 24 years. "How long have you had that ring?" Naomi froze beside Adrian's desk, her fingers tightening slightly around the silver breakfast tray as morning sunlight stretched across the polished floor between them. The question lingered in the air heavier than it should have. "How long have you had that ring?" Adrian repeated quietly, his dark eyes fixed not on her face, but on the thin silver chain partially visible near the collar of her uniform. Naomi swallowed carefully before answering. "Since I was a child, sir." Adrian stood slowly from behind the desk, every movement controlled, though something restless burned beneath the calm surface he showed the world. "Who gave it to you?" Naomi lowered her eyes again. "Someone from the orphanage where I grew up." Adrian's heartbeat seemed to slow painfully inside his chest. "St. Catherine's?" Naomi looked up then, surprised for the first time since entering the room. "Yes." Silence settled between them. Outside, rain clouds drifted across the Manhattan skyline, while the city moved on below, completely unaware that 24 years of lost history stood quietly inside one room. Naomi shifted uneasily beneath Adrian's stare. "Was there anything else you needed, sir?" she asked softly. Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but before the words could come, the study doors suddenly opened behind her. Vanessa Sinclair stepped inside, carrying her phone and a sharp expression already sharpened further by irritation. "Adrian, your mother just called about the charity gala next." Her voice stopped abruptly the moment she noticed Naomi standing near the desk. More importantly, she noticed the look Adrian was giving her. Vanessa's eyes narrowed almost instantly. "Am I interrupting something?" Adrian's expression hardened back into its usual unreadable calm. "No." Vanessa crossed the room slowly in cream-colored heels that clicked against the marble floor like tiny warning shots. "Interesting," she said lightly while setting her handbag onto the leather sofa. "Because your staff usually leaves before personal conversations begin." Naomi immediately stepped back. "I apologize, ma'am. I was just bringing breakfast." Vanessa glanced toward the necklace chain visible against Naomi's skin, and recognition flashed across her face. "Ah," she said softly. "The sentimental ring again." Naomi instinctively touched the necklace beneath her collar. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. Vanessa noticed too, and suddenly the atmosphere inside the study shifted into something colder. "You know," Vanessa continued casually while pouring herself coffee from the silver tray, "I actually asked one of the staff about that necklace this morning. Apparently you wear it every single day." Naomi remained silent. "That must mean the ring is very important." Vanessa smiled faintly before adding, "Or you simply enjoy attention more than you pretend." "Vanessa," Adrian warned quietly. But Vanessa ignored him. "What exactly is it?" she asked Naomi directly. "Some childhood fantasy?" Naomi looked down at the floor. "It was a promise." Vanessa laughed softly beneath her breath. "Of course it was." Adrian's jaw tightened. Naomi tried to move toward the door. "If there is nothing else, I should return downstairs." "Wait." Adrian's voice stopped her immediately. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. He stepped around the desk slowly until he stood only a few feet away from Naomi. Close. Enough now to clearly see the tiny scratch shaped like a star along the edge of the silver ring beneath the chain. The exact same crooked mark he carved there with frozen hands at 12 years old. Adrian stared at it in complete silence. Vanessa watched the expression on his face change in ways she had never seen before. Not desire. Not curiosity. Something far more dangerous. Recognition. Her eyes narrowed immediately. "Adrian," she said carefully, "why are you looking at her like that?" Naomi seemed equally confused now, her breathing uneven beneath the weight of his attention. Adrian lifted his gaze slowly from the ring to her eyes. The same cautious eyes from St. Catherine's. Older now, tired now, but unmistakably hers. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, Adrian Moretti realized the little girl who once believed in him had spent nearly a year walking through his mansion while he never even noticed she was there. The silence inside Adrian Moretti's study became so heavy that even Vanessa Sinclair seemed unsure whether to speak again. Morning light stretched across the marble floors while steam slowly curled from untouched coffee cups beside the silver tray Naomi still held carefully in trembling hands. Adrian could not stop looking at her. Every small detail pulled another memory from the ruins of his childhood. The way she lowered her eyes when uncomfortable. The way her fingers instinctively protected the necklace near her collar. Even the softness in her voice sounded painfully familiar now that he finally allowed himself to hear it. Naomi shifted uneasily beneath the intensity of his stare. "Sir?" she asked quietly. Adrian swallowed once before speaking. "Where did you say you got that ring?" Vanessa crossed her arms immediately. "Seriously?" she interrupted sharply. "It is a cheap necklace, Adrian." But Adrian ignored her completely. Naomi hesitated before answering. "A boy gave it to me at St. Catherine's." Adrian's chest tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. "What was his name?" Naomi looked confused now, uncertain why one of the most powerful men in New York suddenly cared about a forgotten orphanage memory. "Adrian," she answered, softly after a moment. "I think his name was Adrian." Vanessa laughed once in disbelief. "This is absurd." But neither of them looked at her. Adrian took another slow step closer to Naomi. "What do you remember about him?" Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, embarrassed by how personal the question felt. "Not much anymore," she admitted quietly. "We were kids." Adrian said nothing. Naomi's fingers touched the ring again unconsciously. "He used to tell me stories when we could not sleep," she continued softly, "about how someday he would become important and buy us a real apartment with heat during winter." Adrian's breathing became uneven for the first time in years. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Adrian." Her voice carried warning now. Naomi gave a faint smile at the memory despite herself. "Most people forgot each other after leaving St. Catherine's. But he was kind to me when nobody else was." Adrian's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "And the ring?" Naomi looked down at it carefully. "He gave it to me one night because I was crying after another girl got adopted." Her eyes softened slightly with distant memory. "He said somebody would choose me someday too." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He remembered every word, every hallway, every freezing winter night where they survived by pretending impossible dreams were real. Vanessa stepped forward now, irritation finally cracking through her polished composure. "Enough." The sharpness in her voice startled Naomi immediately. "This is becoming inappropriate." Adrian opened his eyes slowly. "Leave us." Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me." "Leave us, Vanessa." The room went completely still. Naomi looked horrified by the tension suddenly unfolding around her. Vanessa's face flushed beneath perfect makeup. "You are dismissing me over a maid?" Adrian's expression hardened instantly into something cold enough to freeze the entire room. "I said leave." Vanessa looked at Naomi with open contempt now. "You have got to be kidding me." Naomi stepped backward immediately. "Ma'am, I did not do anything." "No," Vanessa replied sharply. "That is exactly the problem. Women like you survive by pretending innocence, while men project fantasies onto you." Adrian's jaw tightened dangerously. "Enough." Vanessa looked at him for several long seconds before grabbing her handbag from the sofa. "You are making a mistake," she said coldly. Adrian never answered. Vanessa turned and walked toward the study doors in furious silence, her heels striking the marble floor hard enough to echo through the room. But before leaving, she glanced back once more at Naomi with narrowed eyes full of humiliation and suspicion. Then she disappeared. The study doors closed softly behind her. Silence returned instantly. Naomi stood frozen near the desk, clearly overwhelmed and confused by everything happening around her. Adrian stared at her for another long moment before speaking quietly. "Do you remember what else that boy promised you?" Naomi looked down at the ring hanging against her chest. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "He said one day he would come back for me." Adrian's eyes darkened with emotion too heavy to hide anymore. "Naomi," he said slowly, carefully, like speaking the truth aloud might somehow break it. "I never stopped trying." Naomi stared at Adrian Moretti as though the world beneath her feet had suddenly shifted into something unrecognizable. The silver tray in her hands trembled faintly before she carefully set it down on the edge of the desk, afraid she might drop it entirely. Morning light poured through the tall windows behind Adrian, casting pale gold across the study walls lined with leather books and framed photographs from a life built far away from cold orphanage hallways and broken vending machine rings. "No," Naomi whispered softly, shaking her head once. "That cannot be possible." Adrian did not move closer. Somehow that made the moment feel even more overwhelming. "You used to sit beside the radiator near the third-floor hallway because it was the warmest spot in winter," he said quietly. Naomi's breathing caught. Adrian's eyes never left hers. "You hated oatmeal Tuesdays. You always traded your raisins for extra cornbread." Naomi's fingers slowly rose toward her mouth. "And every Christmas," Adrian continued, his voice roughening with emotion he could no longer fully hide, "you used to pretend the lights outside the church windows were stars instead of traffic." Tears filled Naomi's eyes instantly. Memories she had buried beneath years of survival came rushing back all at once. The freezing halls of St. Catherine's. A stubborn orphan boy with bruised sneakers and impossible dreams. The way he used to stand in front of her whenever older children teased her for crying too easily. "Adrian," she whispered shakily. He gave the smallest nod. That was all it took. Naomi's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She grabbed the edge of the desk for balance as tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Oh my God." Adrian moved toward her immediately, then stopped himself halfway, as though afraid sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality standing between them. "I looked for you," he admitted quietly. "After I left St. Catherine's, I came back 2 years later." Naomi stared at him through tears. "I was already gone." "I know." His jaw tightened painfully. "They told me your foster placement moved you out of state. There were no records after that." Naomi wiped quickly at her face, embarrassed by her own emotions. "I thought you forgot." Adrian actually looked stunned by the idea. "Forgot?" His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Naomi, you were the only good thing I remember from that place." The room fell silent except for the faint sound of rain beginning again against the windows. Naomi looked down at the ring hanging against her chest. "I almost sold it once," she admitted softly. Adrian's expression changed immediately. "When?" "A few years ago." Naomi gave a weak laugh through tears. "My foster mother needed medication after surgery. I had $12 left in my bank account." Adrian's chest tightened painfully. "But I could not do it." She touched the ring carefully. "It reminded me there was at least one person in the world who once promised I mattered." Adrian looked away briefly then, his composure cracking for the first time in decades. All the wealth surrounding him suddenly felt meaningless compared to the quiet woman standing barefoot emotionally in front of memories he never truly escaped. "You did matter," he said firmly. "You still do." Naomi searched his face carefully now, trying to reconcile the orphan boy she once knew with the powerful man standing before her in an expensive black suit beneath Manhattan sunlight. "You really became somebody," she whispered. Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. "Not the kind of somebody we imagined back then." Naomi noticed then what she had somehow overlooked all morning. Near Adrian's wrist, partially visible beneath the cuff of his shirt, was a faded scar shaped like a thin, crooked line. Her breath caught instantly. 24 years earlier, a broken radiator pipe at St. Catherine's had burst during winter. Adrian cut his wrist, pulling her away from the hot steam before staff arrived. Naomi slowly reached toward the scar without thinking. Adrian went completely still beneath her touch. Tears filled her eyes all over again. "It really is you," she whispered. And for the first time in years, Adrian Moretti looked less like the man feared across New York and more like the orphan boy who once sat beside her beneath flickering hallway lights promising impossible things with complete sincerity. 3 nights later, the Moretti mansion filled once again with music, candlelight, and the polished laughter of New York's wealthiest families. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above silk gowns and black tuxedos while servers moved carefully between marble columns carrying trays of champagne beneath the soft sound of a string quartet playing near the staircase. Officially, the evening was supposed to celebrate Adrian Moretti and Vanessa Sinclair's upcoming engagement announcement to several influential business partners and political donors. But from the moment guests began arriving, Whispers moved quietly through the ballroom like smoke. Vanessa stood near the center of the room in a silver designer gown worth more than most people earned in a year, yet tension sharpened every movement she made. Adrian had barely spoken to her in 3 days. Worse, he had spent those same 3 days quietly changing. Staff noticed it first. The man once known for emotional distance now asked whether Naomi had eaten during double shifts. He instructed management to shorten overnight cleaning rotations after learning she sometimes worked 16-hour days. Yesterday, he personally approved medical coverage for every household employee without explanation. Nobody understood why, except Naomi herself, who remained overwhelmed by the impossible reality unfolding around her. Tonight, she moved carefully through the ballroom in her usual black uniform, trying desperately to ignore the way Adrian's eyes found her no matter where she stood in the room. It terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. "You are shaking," Rosa whispered while adjusting silverware beside her near the dining area. Naomi forced a faint smile. "I know." Across the ballroom, Vanessa finally noticed Adrian watching Naomi again. Humiliation flashed across her face before hardening into anger. She crossed the room immediately, heels striking sharply against marble floors while nearby conversations slowly quieted beneath the growing tension. "Enough," Vanessa said coldly, loud enough for surrounding guests to hear. Naomi immediately stepped backward. Adrian's expression darkened instantly. "Vanessa," but she ignored him completely. "I have spent days listening to rumors about a maid," she snapped. "Do you understand how ridiculous that sounds?" The room began falling silent around them. Naomi lowered her eyes. "Ma'am, I never intended." "No," Vanessa interrupted sharply. "Women like you never intend anything. You just stand quietly while powerful men become fascinated with your tragic little stories." Adrian stepped forward immediately. "That is enough." But Vanessa's embarrassment had already turned cruel. Her eyes locked onto the silver chain around Naomi's neck. Still wearing the orphan ring? Before Naomi could react, Vanessa grabbed the necklace sharply enough for the chain to snap loose. The small silver ring fell onto the marble floor with a soft metallic sound that somehow echoed through the entire ballroom. Silence swallowed the room instantly. Naomi stared down in shock. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, while others watched with open curiosity. Vanessa looked down at the ring with disdain. "A cheap toy from a broken childhood," she said coldly. Then Adrian Moretti moved. He crossed the ballroom slowly, every guest stepping aside without a word, as the most feared man in the room walked directly toward the fallen ring lying against polished marble beneath chandelier light. Naomi's breathing became uneven. Vanessa suddenly looked uncertain for the first time all evening. Adrian stopped in front of the ring and stared at it for one long silent second. Then, to the complete shock of every person watching, he lowered himself to one knee. The ballroom went completely still. Adrian carefully picked up the tiny silver ring with both hands, as though it were worth more than every diamond surrounding them combined. When he finally stood again, his eyes never left Naomi. "Do not ever touch something that belongs to her again," he said quietly to Vanessa. No one in the room breathed. Adrian turned fully toward Naomi then, his voice calm, but carrying through the silent ballroom with absolute certainty. 24 years ago, I gave this ring to a little girl at St. Catherine's because she was the only person who treated a poor orphan boy like he mattered. Tears filled Naomi's eyes instantly. Guests exchanged stunned glances while Adrian gently placed the broken necklace chain and ring into Naomi's trembling hands. "Everything I became," he continued softly, "started the night she believed I could become more than what the world said I was." Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "Adrian," but he never looked at her again. His attention remained completely fixed on Naomi, the maid everyone once ignored standing beneath crystal chandeliers with tears shining down her cheeks. "I searched for you for half my life," Adrian said quietly. "And somehow you ended up here carrying trays through my home while everyone looked past you." Naomi could barely speak through emotion. "Why did it take you so long?" Adrian's expression softened in a way nobody in that ballroom had ever seen before. "Because," he answered gently, "I had to become powerful enough to finally keep my promise." And that night, beneath golden chandeliers and the stunned silence of New York's elite, the man feared across the entire city, stood before a Black Maid with more tenderness than he had ever shown the world, while everyone in the room finally remembered what dignity looked like.